can imagine that for some individuals who have a midlife crisis and or those individuals who elect to have cosmetic surgery, there may be some issues with how they're seeing their self. I'm certainly not saying that that applies for everyone, but it could apply for some. And when we talk about self, obviously there are lots of different self terms that we could talk about, but let's talk about self-esteem in midlife. As a whole, research has shown that again, as a whole, on average, that self-esteem is actually increasing in midlife. So contrary to what we were just talking about, that it's actually, improving. However, a related construct of well-being seems to be lowest in middle age. We've already talked about this idea. We've talked about it when we were talking about adolescents and parents of adolescents. Now, not all those who are middle-aged have adolescent children or have children at all. But what the research suggests is that one of the reasons why well-being is the lowest in middle age is because of the amount of roles or the number of roles that people are just having to juggle. So people could be parents and perhaps parents of adolescents. People are really devoted to their jobs, and there are individual differences, but they're workers as a whole. Perhaps they're caregivers to their own parents, and many other roles, friend, partner, all of those things. And so it's a lot to juggle. Also, there's this issue of not having a sense of control over some of these things. When we're talking about being a parent of an adolescent, that definitely is playing a role. Remember that parents of adolescents are reporting lowest life satisfaction and marital satisfaction. And so obviously it's complicated depending on how many different roles you have and how much of a sense of control you feel like you have. So I think that these are interesting findings that on average self-esteem is increasing, but overall well-being is decreasing during this time period. This isn't going to apply to all of those individuals in midlife at any given time, but when we look at the research broadly, these are some of the findings that emerge. We're going to talk more about identity and issues related to this. In the next slide, we're going to get into Erikson's theory. Again, we've talked about Erikson when we were talking about adolescence, and you'll see how his theory also fits for those in midlife as well. When I typically teach child development as its own class, we spend a significant amount of time talking about Erik Erikson's and the different stages of psychosocial development. When we talk about this in human development, we have less time to do that. So we focus more on identity because, as I mentioned with Erik Erikson's theory, that identity really has the changes that have that occur during adolescence are really supported by empirical research. So although Erikson's ideas were a theory and not necessarily empirically based, we do see in more contemporary research the level of change that's happening in identity in a way that goes along with Erikson's theory. So, just so that we're all on the same page, this is a stage theory like Piaget, and there's just different stages depending on how old you are, and you're supposed to go through one stage before moving on to the next stage. And what Erikson would argue is that if you don't resolve the crisis or task at each stage, it's kind of like you're going to be stuck with problems. And, it's one of those things you're always going to have issues. Like I said, we've already talked about this with adolescence and identity and the problems that can emerge if that identity crisis isn't resolved. That's why I have a red box around that one, that we've already kind of talked about that one. We talked about the different reasons why Erikson said identity was changing during this time period. We talked about psychosocial moratorium and the role that others play. But now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about intimacy versus isolation, which is the next stage here, 21 to 39. Now, I know that this is like, let's say, more of this early adulthood time period, But midlife really, I mean, this is going to extend into midlife for some individuals for sure. And also, it's a stage theory. So when we actually look at the research and we know that it's more continuous than discontinuous. So these stages, I'm going to just say, are more fluid than what was proposed by Erickson. And then the stage with the second red arrow is the generativity versus stagnation stage, which you see is about 40 to 65 years old. And I'll explain both of these stages on the next slide. So that first stage we're going to talk about, intimacy versus isolation, is this idea that the goal is to form close relationships and to develop that capacity for a romantic type of love. And obviously, for many individuals, they start to do this and achieve this in early adulthood, so in one's 20s, early 30s. So it's not the case that Erickson was totally, out of line when he proposed this in his theory. But you have to, realize, and obviously this is something that you may have even seen other people in your life have experienced themselves, that for some people, like, we learn these skills later in life. And so it's not necessarily happening just in one's 20s. So Erickson said that if you don't, you're not able to develop these close relationships in early adulthood, then the outcome or the crisis is that you're going to feel socially isolated, which could be problematic for you long term. The next stage is generativity versus stagnation. And this is what Erickson said is the stage for middle-aged adults. But this is the idea that middle-aged adults are supposed to develop this sense of like, they're making a difference in the world. They're contributing to the world. And they can do this in a number of ways. So this was actually an interesting point by Erickson, that there's not one right way to achieve like this purpose or this sense that you're doing good. So Erickson said that you usually do this through family. So for example, if you have children and you're raising them, it's like you feel like you have a purpose or a reason to be, like you are setting up the next generation of individuals to succeed themselves. Or you could do this through work. And so, like, perhaps in your career path, you're doing something that is bringing you joy, but it's also contributing to the world in some way. We could do it through both family and work. So there are some individual differences. Erickson would argue that if you don't have this opportunity or ability to develop this sense of contribution to the world, then what happens is that you feel like you have a lack of purpose. And a lack of purpose is going to be related to many different negative downstream consequences. But again, just feeling like you're stuck and having no purpose is going to be problematic. Just want to remind everybody, Erickson's theory is a theory. So he did not do empirical tests on it, did not have participants where he was studying these ideas, but just looked at the world around him and what are the common problems and or achievements during any given time in the lifespan. So what I want to talk about next is some research that is actually looking at these different stages to see what the research has actually found. So not just a theoretical perspective, but an empirical or research-based perspective. Before I get into the details of this particular study, I want to say that this data was based on the Rochester longitudinal study. So every once in a while, including the Seattle longitudinal study that I talked about in the last lecture, um, there are these studies that come about that have been studied for decades, and they lead to lots of really interesting findings. For the Rochester longitudinal study, I actually had a very, very small role in this study. Right when I graduated from college, I stayed for another year to do research. This is a way to get more research experience before going into grad school. And when I was doing that research project, I was looking at a more recent group of individuals from this study who were reporting on major life events that, changed their life in some way. And so I was just a very, very, very small, there's been, literally hundreds of researchers who have worked on this longitudinal study over time. For this particular research, well, anyway, I just think that that's cool that I did have a small role in the Rochester longitudinal study. But in this particular research study, these researchers were looking at data from the 1940s and 1950s. And specifically, they were looking at data for when people were in their early 20s and college age in the 40s and 50s. So you imagine, obviously, now they're much older. And the study was complex overall, but they were looking in general at two research questions. So the two research questions are, do people who have a committed relationship early in adulthood, so those who are like having committed relationships in their, let's say their 20s, early 20s, would they show more resolution for these issues of intimacy and generativity? So the idea is like if you are meeting the criteria to move out of this crisis stage, do you have better outcomes? Okay. The second research question is, do people who have children early in adulthood, so again, early 20s, show more resolution for issues of intimacy and generativity? So it's the same idea. The idea is that if you are meeting these milestones, especially since these milestones were met earlier in, let's say, the 40s and 50s than they are today. We know the average age of, let's say, getting married, although marriage isn't the only way that we can measure committed relationship, or having children are later now than they were, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. But if you're meeting these milestones early in life, do you basically do better than individuals who don't meet these at the time that society has designated us that we should be meeting these milestones? So let's look at the data. What did they find? So going back to that first research question, the first research question is looking at meeting the milestone of having an early committed relationship. Does that actually set you up to be, meeting these goals of intimacy and generativity? What they found is more for intimacy. So there wasn't a big difference in generativity between those who had an early committed relationship and those who did not. But those who were in a committed relationship early in adulthood, obviously did well. But those not in a committed relationship early in adulthood showed gains over time. And eventually they exceeded those on intimacy than those who were in early relationships, early committed relationships. So essentially, those individuals who are not meeting that milestone in their early 20s eventually catch up in intimacy to those who were in a committed relationship early on, but also surpass them. And you see that there's two data sets here, right here in this little figure, from the 1946 cohort and the 1957 cohort, and measuring them until their, let's say, late 50s. And there's some missing data here. But nevertheless, the point here is that those individuals who were not in a committed relationship in their 20s, not only did they catch up on intimacy over time, but they actually surpassed those individuals who had gotten into a committed relationship early on. So this is not saying anything disparaging about those individuals who formed early relationships. It's just going to show that intimacy isn't just this time that are, you're not supposed to just achieve all of your goals in your 20s. This is why the stage theory is problematic, or one of the reasons, because we know that it's not that simple, that we're making gains in these different areas of psychosocial development over time, and that even if we aren't meeting these milestones that are set from us by society, it doesn't mean that we won't eventually get there. And in fact, looking at this data, not only will we not get there, but we might even be showing more gains or better intimacy skills than individuals who were gaining these skills earlier. I think that those are really positive findings overall. Let's look at the other research question.